Malta and Gozo. We have these talks every month. Here in Gozo, it's always on the first Friday of the month. In Malta, on the first Wednesday. So you can rest assured that every first Friday of the month, we have a talk here. I suppose you have given your email so we can communicate. Okay. It would be nice if you tell your friends. We're always doing our best to have the best speakers here. Today we've got Meinrad Calleja. He studied at the University of Malta, communications and Arabic studies. He studied also Chinese or Japanese, what was it? Chinese.
Social and Arabic studies.
Yes, but he studied Japanese, which is fascinating. Chinese, which is fascinating. However, his interests are much broader. Contemporary philosophy, especially the concept introduced by Foucault, and on social control, and this aspect touches on issues of identity. It is about identity that we'll be listening tonight, especially in relation to sexuality. I should add that Meinrad, apart of studying academically, has a wide experience in traveling, especially in North Africa, amongst what we call the Arabs, and so he's got this experience of the Mediterranean very pronounced. Okay, right.
Thank you, and thank Gozo Foundation for inviting me to speak. Today I'll go straight away to the title without further ado. The title is Sexuality and the Self. Over the recorded history of mankind, sexuality has always played a very important part in defining the self. And the self then becomes objectified, and there are various complexities which emanate from these types of relationships. In today's discussion, what I would like to bring about is a very synoptic, chronological order of sexuality, how through history it has changed, the changes and the main points of juncture, where there were mutations, where there were diversifications and changes in how sexuality was conceptualized, and the theoretical underpinnings regarding sexuality. And then to move on to closer to the present, changes in technology, changes in science, changes in neurology, etc., which then have a different type of formatting on sexuality, and how sexuality is perceived to have a relationship with the self, and how the sex itself changes its conception as well through this different types of accelerated change. So I can start off. I will go back to the pre-Socratic philosophers in Greece, and the pre-Socratic philosophers, we're talking about 1000 BC, 1500 BC, discussed sexuality. Sexuality was a thematic that existed throughout history. If you see in ancient Rome, in Persia, in India, in Japan, in China, in different jurisdictions, even in the Arab world, sexuality was a very important component of life. And social intercourse among people, sexuality played a very important part. However, when we talk about sexuality, various interferences imposed constraints on sexuality and the way people understood sexuality. There were also accretions which came through time from different ideologies, including religions, of course, and the moral sphere, which changed the course of philosophy through different historical junctions. In the pre-Socratic epoch in Greece, the writings of philosophers like Xenophon and others discussed philosophy from a Greek perspective. It was a Hellenic-centric perspective of sexuality, and sexuality meant something completely different to what it means today. First of all, there were no moral or ethical codes in the sense that we understand them today. In pre-Socratic Greece, the sexuality took place on different fronts. Citizens were divided by a hierarchy people were divided by hierarchy, not just citizens, so they would have a components of slaves, rural dwellers, town dwellers, and noble families and aristocracy of Greece. Each different component, social component, had a different value in sexuality and a different definition in the self, how the self was determined. So, for example, slaves, nothing was considered immoral regarding sexuality among slaves and between anyone else with their own slaves. With town dwellers and city dwellers, there was another delineation, they were different. But when we talk about the Greek elite defined themselves as a propertied class. Apart from being propertied class, they also had titleships and they had various official public functions within the city. To maintain those functions, sexuality was recorded in detail to assess whether a person was a viable candidate for a position of power. So immediately we have power being brought into the equation of sexuality. For example, between city dwellers and non-city dwellers, there was a distinction. City dwellers were interested in having any type of sex they could with the opposite sex. So males with females could do anything could be done. There wasn't an official value in monogamy or in faithfulness to a wife. It was completely different. But then they also courted boys. We're talking about the males, only males here. Boys from their same status. So city dwellers, who were important to the aristocracy, young boys, as soon as they reached puberty, the rule was having a beard. They could enter the city domain, go to public discussions, go to gymnasiums, go to lyceums, go to public meetings, etc., discussions, whatever they were, and they would be courted by a man who would test the boy's ability to become a leader in the future. In here, a lot of points became related to sexuality. The older men would usually seduce the younger men, and you have even in Greek mythology gods who came down to abduct a boy who was very beautiful, and even later in Greek philosophy, Socrates writes about boys and Plato, etc., etc. So the domain was different to what we believe it to be today. In this domain, however, power became impregnated into sexuality, and sexuality became recorded as a very important linkage to power. The first obvious relationship to power, which comes about through this form of sexuality, is that in a relationship between two men, in this case, first of all, you have the older man who's in high in society, already in a position. He could be a judge, a teacher, a lawmaker, etc. With the boy who's still a candidate, hasn't yet reached his position in life, but is going through a period of training where he will be eventually chosen. The sex that took place, obviously, involved penetration. Penetration could be in either direction, as we're talking about two different males. So, the ethical questions, which was first brought up, and this continues now, I'm going further ahead after from pre-Socratic to Socratic philosophy now, we start having discussions about what is moral in penetration between two males. So, is it ethical for an owner and a master to have sex with his slave if the slave penetrates the master? The issue of penetration became the most important focal point on sexuality. Women were completely excluded from this domain of discussion. There was very little philosophical discussion about women. That came much later, and the women were well thought of as a person who stays at home and looked after the economy of the household, which included farming, agriculture, taking care of slaves, etc. But between males, this discussion focused very exclusively on penetration. And the issue of penetration became that the penetrator in the hierarchy of power had more power than the person who was penetrated. So we start having a lot of ethical discussions. Can a master be penetrated by his slave? Can a master be penetrated by his student? Etc., etc. And all these come into the domain of discussion. And gradually, there's a distinction between the penetrated and the penetrator, which is as follows. The penetrator is active, while the person being penetrated is passive. So this is the first crucial distinction. One is active, one is passive in the hierarchy of power. The second distinction is that one is in a superior position and one is in a subordinate position. Always the penetrator is in a superior position and the penetrated is in a subordinate position. One dominates, the penetrator was believed to dominate, and the penetrated was believed to be dominated. One commands, again the penetrator, and one complies, the penetrated. One is a vanguard and one is vanquished. In this discussion, the focus then moved on with time whether it was moral to continue having these relationships with boys who were of the same class, we mustn't forget, because all other subjects were not considered as important, and anything could be done with slaves, except with town dwellers. We're talking about city dwellers in the elites of ancient Greece. So this moves on then to an issue of whether they should continue having these boys. Why? Because if a boy was in a position where he was subordinate, how could he be chosen then in the future, for example, to become a judge, or to become a town leader, or to become a magistrate, or to become a teacher? So the position now, the relationship of the sexual subject, in this case we're talking about a boy who was penetrated, changes completely whether he can hold public office, whether he can qualify to become into citizen. There are Greek terms. The debut of the boy is called dokimasia. They're not really important in this discussion because it will be too long to go into the Greek discussion. But there are various terminology in Greek, which is a series of qualifications, categories, enumerations, hierarchies, mainly with a hierarchy of power. So sexuality immediately becomes linked to an ideology of power, and it moves on. After the Greek period, we have the incursion of two monotheistic faiths. Forgetting the third monotheistic faith, which is Judaism, which was previous. But we talk about now Christianity and Islam. In Islam, sexuality is treated, contrary to popular belief, it's treated rather fairly. Although they ban certain things, for example, homosexuality is banned, etc., etc., but the treatment of women changes completely. They're not objectified. However, in Christianity, there is a continuation of the same binary positions we saw earlier between active and passive, superior and subordinate, dominated and dominated, etc., commander and compliant. And this position now becomes exclusively the domain of women. Women are charged and identified and categorized with being the subordinates. So there is a gender shift, which is taken out formally between equals, because we're talking about Greek equals in the city from dominant families. Now it changes and it becomes exclusive and simplified into two binary opposites, the male and the female. The female automatically is regarded in philosophical discussions, in religions, in ideologies, as being the subordinate subject, and the male as being the dominant. And this moves on. Later on in the 18th century, when we come to the Victorian era, sexuality becomes re-problematized. First of all, it becomes the domain of the bedroom between a pair of opposite sexes, between a male and a female. Whatever is going to happen in sexuality is restricted to the private sphere. There is no discussion as such, and no amplification, no philosophical investigation into sexuality, except into antisocial behavior or into antinormative behavior. So sexuality becomes associated with a lot of problems. First of all, it's considered to be a useless form of expenditure of energy. We're talking about, of course, now coming from the Greek times up to the Victorian times, so 17th, 18th century. It is solely focused on pleasure originally, and it also involves irregular modes of behavior. This is how they looked at sexuality. So sexuality gradually becomes banished. And we know that in the Victorian times, for example, everything was considered to be in the realm of sexuality. Everything was considered to be a sexual proposition. So if I am trying not to think about water, for example, because I'm in the desert, everything I think about will be about water. In this regard, in the Victorian age, it was presupposed that everyone was continuously talking about or thinking about sexuality. So every form of proposition, this microphone, would have a sexual connotation. The legs of chairs would have sexual connotations. Everything was believed to be a trigger to an arousal of a sexual proposition. So sexuality, rather than becoming subordinate and becoming the realm of silence, it actually became one of the most important events in human thinking all the time, continuously. So the attempt to ban sexuality from the domain of the public and to restrict it with a lot of constraints, with a very strong and rigid normative order, and with very rigid conventions, limiting it only, first of all, to two people in a monogamous relationship of opposite sexes, limiting it to a private sphere where what is done is not of no interest and is not exposed to anyone at all. Sexuality actually becomes a very visible in the consciousness of the self proposition. The proposition is continuously there because of the fact that it is being continuously banned. And this is a very form of dialect, which brings out the philosophy of a negation. If I have water here and I refuse to drink it, this is a negation. If I don't have water and I'm very thirsty and I can't drink, that's a deprivation. Now, in most human intercourse, the absence of sexuality is a deprivation. It is considered to be a deprivation. People have and suffer. There are various forms of different types of behavior and modification which comes about because of an absence of sex. It's a biological function. It happens in animals as well. It happens in all species, different species. That's a deprivation. However, in the Victorian age, there is a very strong attempt to reverse the order of a deprivation in sexuality and to make it a negation. In other words, people should deny sex. People should have repressed their instinctual drives to have sex. So the self becomes a person involved in a relationship trying to subordinate passionate feelings inside, arousals, etc., which are sexual, and denying them and negating them. This was meant to be something which was privileged among the privileged classes. Now, the privileged classes are classes who define themselves by blood. In Europe, we're talking about, this is a Eurocentric proposition, because sexuality, I'm now limiting myself mainly to Europe, because sexuality in other domains had different developments. But sexuality in the Eurocentric zone, which involves, of course, not just Europe, physically, geographically Europe, but all people who are led by the same beliefs. And here we can talk widely and broadly about Christianity. So when Christianity was spread to the imperial domains, there was also an export of the theories of celibacy, the theories of abstinence, the theories of negation of sexuality to indigenous people who could not understand the transition taking place. Now, the transition was taking place also because of socio-economic and political reasons. With industrialization coming about, the beginning of industrialization, there was a need for what we call now as the Malthusian couple. So a couple, a male and a female, with a division of labor clearly identified between the male and the female, where the male would procure the economic productive forces and exchange his value on the market, while the woman would take care of the domestic milieu and bring up children, etc. And this was a functional and utilitarian perspective of sexuality. The union of two people would increase the productivity of the large industrial imperial countries. Mainly, of course, we're talking about most of the top European monarchies. But when they exported this ideology to other spheres of countries where they had rules, they were unable to instill these values among the indigenous people. Sexuality now becomes a problematization of desire. Desire is immediately enforced into a vocabulary that gives it negative connotation. The reasons are that in the evaluation of desire, there was an effect of displacement. There's a displacement of desire, an intensification of desire, a reorientation of desire, and a modification of desire. However, there was resistance to these modifications, to these displacements, reorientations of desire, and desire remained a very strong component. As we started off when we talked about the Victorian era, where everything is considered to be a sexual proposition. The sexual proposition in itself leads to desire, and desire was obviously always present in the consciousness of man. So in the conceptualization of the self becomes a desiring subject. And this is one of the first important points that this epoch brought about. As we continue moving from this epoch to future epochs, going down from the 18th to the 19th century up to the 20th century, there was an important shift where populations needed to be managed and administered. So we have a new approach which brings in a form of biopower and biopolitics, where populations needed to be managed. They had and this involved, of course, a control of health, a control of reproduction, a control of movement, and a lot of other biological instances which are related to human populations. Demography became a very important component of the organization of social life. Demography becomes the first, and it still is today, most important administrative concern. It's a functional imperative of most large societies to be able to manage populations, to be able to manage biological reproduction, to be able to manage race, to be able to manage eugenics, to be able to manage gerontology, for example. This has a whole series of discourse which continues to proliferate and expand into the control of populations. If you look at the globe today, the globe is divided into different biological categories. You have categories, for instance, which are laborers, categories which are managers, etc., etc. And there is a biological imprint which continues to grow and to propagate throughout the social sphere. Sexuality now changes again. There is another change where sexuality becomes commodified. So we have the commodification of sexuality, where sexuality becomes a market value. It has a market value, it can be exchanged on a market very easily, it is very easily accessible, and it becomes a service provision. So the service provision of sexuality divided into numerous components. For example, today we have the availability of pornography online. You can have chat rooms, you can have go to lap dancing clubs, to strip clubs, to massage parlors, where sexuality takes on a clinical form. For example, if you go to brothels, there are forms of sterilization procedures which take place before you enter. There are forms of evaluations of the person giving the service and checking the medical position of the service, etc. So the biopower now becomes a very important component in controlling the sexuality which is offered as a service and a commodified service. Now one would think, and some people do still think like this, that sexuality offered on the market and an exchange value, in other words, a person is paying for a service, is considered to be, by many people, still a minor placement on the market itself. And the positioning of sexuality on the market is really restricted and not a major component of exchange. However, in the realm of market economics, it is not that. It is a much wider and broader availability of a service, and transactions run today into large corporations and managed as large corporations, and they exist all over the world in offering sexual services. And these sexual services are commodified. But the commodification of these sexual services changes the self as a subject in sexuality, and the proposition of sexuality now becomes a menu where the subject can choose, can fantasize, can build up, can customize the sexuality to his or her likings, available in a market circuit, in an economy. The actual undertaking of the actual sexuality itself, a sexual act itself, changes as well, because it is broken down into its component parts. I will give you an example. First of all, in any form of sexual activity which is for sale, okay, whatever it may be, whether it is prostitution, direct full sex, for example, or any form of other, or a massage parlor, or a gentleman's club, or a brothel, any form of, the first concept which comes into place is time. A person is paying for a period of time. Both a woman or a man, whoever is engaging in this service, will have a time frame which defines a price, because obviously price becomes equated with the exchange. And surplus is the only reason why this is taking place. So the second point is, which is related to surplus, is that the emotions themselves are no longer existing as propositions between two people who are exchanging simultaneously their own propositions in different formats of language. By language, I mean the language of seduction, how people seduce each other, how people make propositions, how people make proposals, etc. The language now changes completely and becomes one of a customized language where a person goes, has his own vocabulary, seeks out the partner which will give him what he's looking for, pays for it within a period of time, and the surplus, which means the profit being made and the exchange being made, the person exchanging his money for the sexual service, removes completely and entirely the exchange of communication between two people on an emotional level. So this is another redefinition of the self. The self changes again, and these might appear to be simple changes, but they're not very simple at all. They're quite complex because the changes bring about, of course, changes in neurological patterns in the brain. And there are different forms of releases and different forms of engagement which take place within the body and within the self, which change through the different forms of sexuality. So the commodification of sex has left a very big change in sexuality. Okay, that's another position. Further apart from this, now we can go into the issue of technology. Technological applications which can be used both in the communication and exchange of sex, but also technological applications which can be used in the actual sexual events taking place within the person, whether on his own or on her own or with other people, etc. There are technological devices which can assist in the arousal and eventual orgasm of the person seeking that response, okay, which becomes the objective of sexuality. So technological applications, even in communication, change the actual way, the composition of sexuality. For example, let's imagine sexuality in virtual reality. People can have sex with a cartoon figure. People can have sex with a blank figure. There's no figure at all. Only in conversation, only in exchange of chats, without ever seeing anyone at all. So sexuality now changes through technology as an available resource, an available service, which then changes the self into an interacting human, interacting with a machine, interacting with a component. Now the other side of the equation, the side of the machine rationality, you know that you can program a computer with hindcasting, with longcasting, with whatever type of algorithms, complex algorithms, to be in a position, with today we have artificial intelligence and various types of different forms of formatting, whereby the appliance itself is available for a much wider range of permutations of possibilities. So if you look, for example, let's take the technology of communication on a normal phone. As you are writing, immediately your telephone gives you various options of what it assumes you are writing. It can have an intelligent type of casting, which then realizes what you are writing and realizes the next stage of the next word. For instance, if you write saint and you want to write Saint Paul's Bay, when you start writing it frequently, it comes up again. Now imagine this taking place in sex, in sexuality, in sexual exchange, in the exchange of propositions. The actual appliance itself will customize itself and reorient itself to the user's demands and the user's compliance. So this changes as well another component of sexuality and the self through technology. In recent technology has discovered a long range and pattern of different types of stimuli which affect the arousal and the control, etc., of sexuality. Now when we go back a bit to Freud, as I said before, the issue coming from ancient Greece about the problematization of penetration, and then the subordination of the woman when it becomes exclusively a sexual relationship between one man and a woman, who she takes on the position of passivity and subordination, and the male takes the position of dominance. The control of women in Freudian times was looked at from a different perspective. Freud was a misogynist. He was like anti-women. He thought of women as all being ill. He has the concept of the hysterical woman and of the neurotic woman. Now, this comes about because from criticisms which came after Freud, for example, from Marcuse, in Eros and Civilization, for example, he critically analyzes Freud and the misgivings of Freud and the failures of Freud. Okay? And some of the most important dominant feature of Freud's failure was the fact that he only looked at misfits. He only looked at very highly problematic people. So his target range was very limited. So his assessment of women was a generalization based on a very small and erroneous sample. and it focused only and exclusively on sexual stimuli. Now this was also brought about the control of women, and the control of women even in countries which consider themselves to be highly emancipated and highly equal, where there's a lot of equality between male and women, between gender, still exists in very subtle ways which might not be obvious to an observer who doesn't go into the depth of analysis. But in neurological studies, there are various forms of control which can take place in the future through appliances which have not yet been conceived in controlling a sexual environment, in controlling stimuli. We already have chemical agents that can assist sexual arousals, for example, and extend them and last them longer, etc., etc. Although the focus of this scientific research tends to mainly concern men and not women. Now, in Freud's assessment of women, there is a possibility that today, for example, in neurology, there is a libido processivity where the loss of this processivity leads to a clinical depression because of the lack of sex. But it's a part of the limbic system. And this can cause a loss of sexual interest, a lot of sexual interest, not a loss of sex, a loss of sexual interest. And there are chemical agents which can actually be used to actually control, in the form of a control, but for example, of birth control and sterilization. In large populations, for example, in India and China, sterilization was enforced by law. Now, there is no reason to assume that in industrialized countries, which industrialized democratic countries, there will not be other forms of subtle control through the use of chemical agents infiltrated into the environment, which might change the dynamics of sexual activity. I'm not saying this is done, it is a conspiracy theory. But in this conspiracy theory, it brings about a possibility. Because we already have large applications coming, for example, from cybernetic controls, from thermostatic controls in the environment, where people can use the technology to assist themselves in their environment. For example, I can be driving home and my computer tells me on my GPS the routes, the fastest route because of traffic jams, etc., etc., and guides me through satellite navigation. I can have a thermostatic thing at home which prepares for myself the environment I want at home. For instance, the AC will switch on when my car approaches a certain region from a GPS tracking, navigation, etc. It can switch on the AC and prepare it for me. I can also have a special application which don't exist yet, but they're in the process of being planned, that will defrost my food from a defroster and put it in the same appliance. Will also be a microwave and cook it for me and prepare it to arrive at the same time. As I move through certain rooms, I can have intelligent lighting and intelligent sound systems that follow me through and switch off and switch on, okay? Now this exists. Now we already have also the availability of internet, which can come through satellites and clouds, in various parts of the world, etc., which are controlled. Even GPS is controlled. GPS is controlled to that certain military areas. You cannot use GPS tracking systems with precision. You can use them more or less with proximity, but not precision. So the climatization we are living in, the environment we're living in, is changing technologically with a lot of applications, which will further change sexuality. And sexuality will change according to these different forms of formatting of technology. And also the propositions that people consume as discourse. If people consume the discourse in the Victorian age of the banning of sexuality, and sexuality was always present in the consciousness and in the mind through propositions which were imagined, through imaginary signification from objects which were not really any form of sexuality, there is no reason to assume that it might not be possible in the future for technological appliances to stimulate the same form of arousal. Okay? This is just an idea, it's not a factual thing, this is a possibility only. But the possibility of itself shows you that the self has become objectified in a way that is no longer perceived as the simple citizen interacting with other equals in a democratic environment where the exchanges are based on knowledge and based on formatting of equal exchange. But the changes in technology will also imply a possibility of changes in the future of sexuality between people. Now, if we move on to different forms of control of women, for example, in pastoral societies, where pastors who brought up sheep, etc., or cattle or whatever, moved away from the home for long periods of time. The women had a form of modification of the clitoris where they would not be able to have sex. In Europe, when people used to go away for long periods of time at sea, either in trade or in war, the women wore a chastity belt.
They were what?
A chastity belt. When what, sorry?
What does that mean?
A chastity belt is a belt worn around the woman's sexual organ, which does not allow her to permit her to have sex.
I know.
Now this happens in various species, okay? In flies, for example, there's a type of barb which in the actual sexual intercourse between flies, the male penetrates into the woman a liquid which then solidifies and becomes like a form of barb, which doesn't allow any other penis except his own to penetrate the fly. In canines, it's the same thing. They secrete an element as well which blocks in certain canine species, not in all dogs, I mean, that as well blocks the vagina of the woman exclusively to the male. So this is not something which is very rare. You know, it exists in species, it's a sort of common thing. So the control of the female.
Excuse me, is it comparable with the condom? I don't understand.
No.
Because I
No, this is a form of, it's a control. It exists in various species in animals and in humans as well, where the woman's sexual organ, the vagina of the woman, is controlled by a male and doesn't allow any other form of sexuality to take place except by the designated male who chose himself, the female herself. And in transactions between males, there is a form of tournament. They call it tournament selection, okay? The males take part in a tournament, which is usually fighting or mastery or some kind of competition, either in voice or in strength, in beating, fighting, brute force, whatever it may be. And the male who wins dominates the females that are available. This is quite a simple thing. But the point I'm trying to make now here is that women, although might believe that through certain feminist movements, etc., a lot of progress has been made, there's still much more progress to be made. And certain biological factors in women do make it more difficult for women to compete on an equal grounding. Now, with discourse in circulation, where the male can continue in certain positions to substitute a female, and there are very big declines in relationship between male and female. There's a decline in most major industrialized countries. The point is, it is very difficult for females to establish an identity of the self in sexuality which doesn't include a male. It's more complex for a woman than for a man, because the woman remains in the subordinate position, even though the discourse has changed, and even though there are a lot of emancipatory discourses and ideologies which empower women, which seemingly empower women. In the rules of hierarchy and catalogue, it's important to understand that in sexuality there are ancillary roles which are played by conventions, which are played by normative orders, which are played by rules and regulations which are imposed, moral codes, ethical codes, etc., etc. I would like to quote a small quotation from a French author, Michel Foucault, who says that a rule of conduct is one thing. The conduct measured by this rule is another. Now this is an important distinction. A rule of conduct is one thing, and the conduct measured, there's a measurement of the conduct, which brings in compliance, which brings in, etc., a whole range of ideological objectives. And this is another important aspect which needs to be appraised in sexuality. That certain rules, there's a term which sounds complex, it's called isomorphism. And sexuality has an isomorphic relations with social. And isomorphism is a construct. And isomorph is a type of geometric construct where each part of a prism or whatever has a relation with everything else. Now sexuality has this relationship with all other forms of social intercourse. So sexuality is important in biology, it's important in the study of organisms, it's important in the study of freedom, it's important in the study of emancipation, of empowerment. And the self is modeled. very strategically by sexuality. So sexuality becomes. So sexuality becomes an important component of the rules. The measurement of the rules today takes place on a macro scale, okay? We have large quantum computers which can control entire regions, entire economies, etc. And all this data can be analyzed much more easily than it was in the past. We already see a geographic distinction and division of sexuality taking place all over the world. For example, if you go to more industrialized economies, you'll find that most of the people who are offering service provisions in sexuality, prostitutes, etc., all come from certain geographic areas. So they are performing a function in the labour market, and sexuality, apart from being commoditized, is also given a value, a psychological value, that it is substantiated as necessary. It is not considered something which is insert over and above, what people have. It's considered a human right. So this sexuality changes the codes and the normative borders of each society. And it also determines as well, it has a biological imprint on the action, and ideological imprint as well, on the political geography taking place on a global scale. Having looked through this, just a very cursory glance, this subject is much more complex than 45 minutes can avail, and each component part requires quite a lot of elucidation and a lot of elaboration. But I tried to do this briefly as possible, without recourse to philosophical language, because there are some philosophical implications as well, which I need not go into. Okay, so this transformative development which takes place, etc., etc. But I just want to keep it simple, and I think I can stop here. Thank you very much.
Excuse me, but I drifted at one point. Are you saying that male use sexuality for dominance and women cannot use sexuality for dominance? Because there were societies which were matriarchal and the woman used sex.
I didn't say that.
I'm sorry,
No.
I admit I drifted.
What I said was that the discourse, the dominant discourse, which came about evolutionary from the Greek times to the present, the woman became the subject of domination through a former value which was attributed to penetration. And the penetration at that time took place between males. When that form of sexuality was eliminated, the values which were inherited through the displacement of the person involved, which were males before, dominant males from a dominant Greek society, became attributed to the woman solely and exclusively because of her position in penetration. Gradually, through time, the labor force required the woman to do certain functions within the home for utilitarian reasons, through industrialization, where the male went out to work. When this was eventually eliminated again, the women became more emancipated and more equal. But the equality between gender doesn't change the configuration of sexuality and doesn't change the codes that are measuring them. That was the point. If that wasn't clear.
You said something about the relationship between men and women is in decline. I didn't catch what you said, so I can't repeat it.
There are studies, okay? Cited and by Sapolsky, who's an American professor, and his main subject is neurology, but he studies a lot of sexual behavior, okay? And in these studies, which are empirical studies, it has been established that, for example, in relationships between male and females, in marriage, the average life of a marriage in industrialized countries is between 2 and 4 years. And relationships between people, but the definition of the relationship means usually not only a sexual relationship or a relationship of exchange, but a relationship which has a more value to that than sexuality. So living together, being a partnership, having a project together, making a life, whatever it may be. That is in decline in most industrialized countries. And people are single both ways.
Okay, so more people are being
Opting not to partner. Or opting not to partner.
Okay,
in
that makes
a relationship which involves commitment. And even in studies by the same Sapolsky, either by him or cited by him, for example, in paternity testing, the paternity testing was much more lower than people imagined it to be. I think it's less than 30%. That the actual father, the couple is the actual father of the child. So there are all these factors, empirical things, which are showing that sexuality is not in any way linked anymore to a monogamous relationship. And the measurement of this measurement shows that there's no longer a relationship of commitment of faithfulness, etc. between the two partners, whoever they may be. It's irrelevant.
Always in the West.
In West industrialized economies.
I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Because from a business perspective, I mean, a marriage is a business contract first and foremost. Before it becomes a religious ceremony, it was always a business contract first. And 1,000 or 100 years ago, if I have sex with a woman and she has a child, I don't know if that's my child, which is important for inheritance of land. But in the 21st century, that's less relevant because
That was the most important thing.
yeah, because I know who's my
Property
child,
and
who's not my child.
yes.
So marriage no longer
But
becomes.
this is interesting, but I think what is commercially relevant is not sex or a couple, it is child rearing. Because if there are no children, it is not exactly a business affair.
Even in all,
But I would say that because the children cost money to rear, then the question will be, who is responsible? The mother brought them, yes, but the father caused them. So, beginning from the rearing of the children and the cost of rearing would influence backwards on who is responsible. Questions of maternity, paternity, marriage, then, and household.
it depends in which
So-
community.
I would say so. I would say that the center of this commercial interest would be at the child rearing.
I think the logic in industry of farming out, okay? When you have an industry, for example, automobile industry, in the past, the automobile industry was national. It was a hypertrophy of the country itself. For example, Ford was made in America, BMW was made in Germany, etc. Okay? And then they gradually started, especially the United States was the first one to start it out by having these industries taken to different locations and being done there. Okay? This logic, the logic of farming out, of outsourcing, okay, to a more favorable environment, also takes place in sexuality. And also takes place in the domain of child rearing. For example, many people choose not to have children, and the birth rate is in decline in all industrialized countries. And it's so problematic, it's to such a level that in, I think, 2020 or 2050, there'll be very big problems in managing, for instance, pension funds. Pension funds. So but then what happened is a creation of a mitigation system where babies are born elsewhere by surrogate mothers, whatever they may be, by proxy, it doesn't make a difference how, or they're actually born from other people, and then adopted from one context and taken to another. And this is not something small. People think it's a relatively small thing, but it's a major multi-billion-dollar industry. The production of babies in third world countries for export. This might be considered something immoral by our standards, but it's a major industry, and it has been brought about by the commodification of sex, but also by other logics which have analogous applications in the mind and change how people consider themselves biologically.
Could I say something?
Yes.
I see your point, but I wouldn't like.
I'm not saying anyway.
No, yes, I'm just. I wouldn't like the idea of tying the idea of surrogate mother to just that scenario.
Sure.
There is
you're
a
right.
much more,
Yes.
how shall I say, friendly
Yes.
use of it. Because if
But
it
I'm talking
goes
about
out.
the ones only for export, I'm talking.
Yes, I know, but I mean, I don't know whether it's going to be reported or not. And if we report just that, we would be giving a very negative idea No, I'm not saying it's a negative thing. Forgive me for saying that. But I would give people who have certain ideas a sort of push forward in a certain direction which will harm other views. I'm sorry to say this, but we've got to be very careful what we present to the media. Do you follow me what I mean?
Just how it happens, what's taking place. I'm not conferring any value or any discriminatory either in favour or against any of this. I'm just saying it is a fact.
I'm not arguing with what you're saying.
Yes.
I'm saying that if this lecture is being reported
Yes.
and an emphasis is made on what you're saying,
Yes.
and the general public will form a certain opinion, it will hurt my interest.
For example, I'll give an example.
Let's make it plain. Because
In
I'm
industrialized
not,
economies in Europe and
sorry?
in industrialized economies in Europe, United States and Canada and Australia, people are imported as laborers from certain destinations.
Yes,
okay?
I
Let me just finish my point. You have also a division of labor of what the laborers are allowed to do. For example, financial services mainly come from Mumbai, from India, etc. Carers come from Philippines and from India. Manual laborers come from Eastern Europe. So there's already this division taking place in all forms of labor, and the human, as a human, the self, has become an exchange value commodity. He exerts his labor on a different market, and different markets create a demand for these people because they want to have a biopower and a biopolitics that controls their populations within a limit that they allow certain intakes of immigration because it's financially more viable than having your own citizens being brought up in your own country. First of all, they come ready at the age when you want them to work. So you have already 20 years where you're not accountable for their upbringing, for their education, for their training, etc. etc. In India, they even have accent acclimatization classes to be able to work in call centers. So this is something, it's not something, a fantasy or some kind of hypothesis, but then it takes place as well on childbirth. Childbirth may be the ugly face of this, but all of it is ugly face in my opinion, but it does take place. There are people, there are certain countries which are white and have no features, maybe they're chosen, they're chosen biologically to fit into a certain category, where they can be imported from those countries to a destination country that want them as children.
Yeah, I agree with
That was the point.
I see. Let me try and
We even have body parts today, kidneys. There are certain countries, like for instance Jordan, that pay Jordan and Egypt, which are poor countries, Algeria, etc., which pay people $8,000 to sell a kidney. And they sell the kidneys on the market. So even body parts are being sold. So this is not something, I'm not talking about some conspiracy.
Okay.
I think
As our next guest.
about commodification, the problem is not commodification itself, it's who makes the money out of these commodities. Because usually it's not, if it's for the self, if it's for me, if I sell myself and I have the profits from it, that is a personal thing. But if my services get sold and someone else gets, I think
in all economic exchange, there's a segment of exploitation as well. But not because it's sex, it's worse. That's the connotation we're giving to sexuality problematizes it, and more over-determined problematization. That's one point. And the second point is that in my analysis, what I wanted to focus on was not the moral or the ethical, but the change of the self. You know, if I look at sex as a menu thing which I can customize, today I want a coloured woman, 6 foot tall, etc., etc., I choose her, and I go and find her on the market and hire her for the service. The point is that this changes, the sexuality. That was my point, not the point of.
Can I make a point before you speak? Because this reminds, because it seems that sometimes we tend to think of sexuality as a spontaneous development throughout the ages, whereas you are saying, seems to be correct, that it was always manipulated. What sex should have meant to people and what people mean through sexuality has always been manipulated, it seems.
Yes, it's been manipulated. One, because sexuality, if it's looked at solely and exclusively as pleasure, you remove from it the biological function of procreation. You remove the emotion, which can be considered as irrational, of love as well, and you're left with solely with pleasure. And that's how it was in ancient Greece. That's how it was in Rome. That's how it was in India, in Japan. You have the Kama Sutra explaining positions of sexuality, contextualizing it, putting it down graphically on a display, showing positions of variance which change, which increase, stimuli, which increase. And Naples in Pompeii, have read it. Throughout history, sexuality has always been an issue of pleasure. It became problematized from the Greek positioning of the penetration, which was related to property, to power, etc., to fields which are totally indifferent, not concerned with sexuality itself. They were independent of sexuality. And then Christianity continued to make it more complex because of the confessional, the problems of the flesh, the problems of desire. And after Christianity, Victorian age and industrialization looked at people as human consumers or producers, taking part in a production line. So the ontological primacy of the human being changed to one solely as a subjectification and objectification of use, utilitarian. And that again changes sexuality again. But today, the changes in sexuality will take place primarily through neurology, developments in neurology, which I didn't have time to go into, assumptions of genetics related to DNA, which are told, some of them are very erroneous, but people still there's a lot of mythology attached to it, and technology. Technological applications will change completely the definition of sexuality again.
It's more like a question, because what you say about the development of sexuality, it sounds very problematic and not nice. And so my opinion is it's because of capitalism that caused that development. So and I think it's very destructive. So the solution would be then to have a less capitalistic society.
Sexuality has always been a threat to capitalism, sexuality, and has always been a threat to power. Why? Because in sexuality, an uninhibited form of sexuality between any number of people, it can be between two, more, one, or whatever, the dominant forces of society do not control. It's a private sphere where people can have pleasure. And pleasure has a greater value than surplus. It has a greater value than many things which people take for granted in capitalist economies, including education, etc., which are forms of control. So sexuality changes because people are trying to control it, not because it itself changes. Even when it becomes commodified, it is essential for capitalism to make sure and ensure that everything can be commodified, whatever it may be. Even religion has to be commodified. It has to be broken down into an exchange, into a possibility of monetary gain, of surplus, of expenses, of everything has to be broken. Not only of material consumption, which we consume, but also consumers of ideas. We are consumers of ideology. We are consumers of discourse and circulation, and sometimes this discourse enters into us in fractions through forms of Trojans which we take in, and we don't understand that we are borrowing logics, like I mentioned before, about the car, automobile industry, farming out, etc., and then people considering it as well for human part. The same sort of analogies by capitalism penetrate into the consciousness of humans by various forms of incremental logic which is impregnated into the mind, which in their little component parts don't make sense, but when you look at them all together, they do direct society to be more consumer pro, to become consumers of discourse, consumers of knowledge, which are all forms of power. Even knowledge, when people which consume knowledge, doesn't necessarily mean, because they reach a conclusion on their own through various syllogisms, how they have a proposition, a predicate, etc., and they finally get the conclusion that they've arrived at that conclusion autonomously. Because the autonomy is not there. People have structured plausibility in their brains, they have plausibility structures, which something seems reasonable and something doesn't seem reasonable. If I tell you I will fly from here to somewhere, it's not plausible, but if I say something, so plausibility is ingrained in human consciousness, and capitalism controls the possibility structures which we take in through our consumption of discourse and knowledge and media and socialization. And through that socialization, our sexuality is a domain which becomes controlled by capitalism for the same reasons. Because if capitalism allows a human a sphere of autonomy and radical freedom, capitalism would collapse gradually and be eroded. And sexuality is a threat actually to capitalism. That's why we